Welcome to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. Today, we're going to talk about women's voices and the opportunity they offer to world climate actions. Women are deeply affected by the climate crisis and the environmental toxins associated with that, particularly women in low-income communities and from the global south, women who are more reliant on natural resources for their survival and more at risk from drought, flooding, and other extreme weather conditions. Yet women continue to demonstrate that they have the strength, the ideas, and the skills to make crucial decisions about how we live with the earth and with each other. Women around the world direct their families' lifestyles and consumption habits. Women farmers feed the world, producing up to 80% of food in the global south. Indigenous women in particular hold invaluable traditional knowledge on regenerative farming and the preservation of our waters and our lands. Women vote more often, they work harder to get out the vote, and they lead on enacting environmental legislation when elected to office. Women are more willing and able to unite across party lines and other boundaries. And studies repeatedly show that countries with more women in government ratify more international environmental treaties. Women are key to political and ecological changes needed to slow the climate crisis and to create a sustainable future. We're joined today on Zoom by Osprey Oriole Lake, founder and executive director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, and author of Story in Our Bones. The story is in our bones, how worldviews and climate justice can remake a world in crisis. Hi, Osprey.
Thanks so much for having me on your show.
So let's just jump right into it. Why is it important to center the voices of women in feminist and climate action?
Well, thanks also for that great introduction that I think really helps set the stage for my response, which is I think that one of the things that has changed over the last years, which I'm excited about, is that this discourse around not only women being most impacted by the climate crisis and environmental degradation, which we have a lot of statistics to show us that, which is due to gender inequality all over the world. But we're also seeing that they are key actors in solutions. And I think that's one of the untold stories about the climate crisis and solutions to the climate crisis. And so just to give a short little history, when I first started wanting to do work around getting involved in mitigating the climate crisis, I spent a lot of time doing research over a decade ago and was just really astonished about the role of women's leadership and how important it was to sustainability solutions. And yet no one was really talking about it. It's still, limited in scope of how much people really understand that it makes a difference to involve women at the decision-making table, that women need to be funded and resourced to do the work they're already doing. And it turns out to be a key factor. So this is why I started the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, or WECAN, to really uplift women's voices from all over the world and to work on projects in different global sectors at points where we thought there would be a lot of leverage, both in terms of on-the-ground projects from reforestation to forest protection and food sovereignty to the highest levels of policy negotiations with governments at the climate talks every year, or with financial institutions like banks and asset management firms, and really present this agenda and really share with all these different institutions and people who are making decisions why women are so key. And I'll just give a few stats so that we have a little grounding in what we're talking about.
Sure.
You gave a few, which I really appreciate. But there's a study that I presented to the Scenarios Forum, which then feeds the IPCC reports. And it shares that when you have just a 1-unit increase in something called the Women's Political Empowerment Index, which is an index that's shared through countries around the world that shows women's political agency or their social involvement or what is their economy like in their country. With just a 1-unit increase in this index, there's an 11.51% decrease in carbon emissions, which is huge. It's really hard to find anything that will make that much of an impact. And so I think we really need to understand and uplift the role of women and see that they are central to mitigating and adapting to the climate crisis. You mentioned food issues around women, which is very central to mitigating the climate crisis and adapting to it. I would also add, issues around water programs. The United Nations has showed many times if you don't involve women in these water programs, they don't work, because women are the ones who are, collecting the water in communities and are the ones feeding and caring for their families and are responsible for water knowledge. I also think we need to look at particularly Indigenous women and their role in protecting biodiversity in their regions. About 80% of all the biodiversity left on Earth, from our forests, our waters, um, the climate itself is protected by Indigenous peoples and is in their stewardship. So I think there's a lot to be said about really uplifting the role of women and understanding that it's key to finding our way through this very difficult time that we face with the climate crisis and environmental degradation, and that we really have to involve women's leadership. And the last thing I'll say, and people can go to our website to see many, many stats and stories, is that, you know, I think that women are also contributing not just intellectual knowledge and bodies of knowledge from their lived experience, but also there's an emotional impact that women are having that I think we can't leave out of the equation, that really has a lot of support that's needed when we do work with negotiations with governments or financial institutions, that we put a human face on what is happening in communities. So women talking about their children and whether or not they have food or water, or if they survived a drought or a flood, and what does it actually mean to bring our human selves, our full selves, to these conversations, so we're not just talking about numbers and stats, but actually our lives. And I think women are contributing to that discourse in a really important way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You mentioned studies, and I've seen several myself, that the more female representation there is in government, the more they ratify not only international treaties, but as you mentioned, carbon, you're seeing carbon drops within those countries just because of the women in government. Why do you think that is? I mean, what is it that women are bringing to that government position that has those outcomes?
Well, I think it's important to note that that I don't think that these sort of social norms are necessarily innate. In other words, I think women and men can both be caring. And I
Yes.
think that we can also talk outside of binaries with gender diverse leaders. Like, people in general can be deeply caring. I think due to social norms that have developed over thousands of years, they haven't just recently arrived. We do live in a patriarchal society all over the world to different degrees. And it has produced a social norm of women being more caring, taking care of their families, and having that role in society. And because of that, we need to address the practicality of that, which means that women are therefore more able to discuss the real lived experiences of what these climate impacts are, environmental degradation impacts are, and are able to discuss them in great detail because they're the ones who are experiencing them. I also find that, when we have inequities, whether that's we see racism or colonization or misogyny, and women being impacted first and worst by a lot of these harms because of these inequities and injustices, that the people impacted the most usually tend to have a really good idea about what needs to happen because they've got to navigate their way through the harm. And so also, I think women are good at expressing what we need to do in a very practical way because they have a disproportionate negative impact that has forced them to talk about resilience and what their needs are. This is also true of Indigenous people and Black and Brown communities. Wherever we see these inequalities and injustices, actually, when you go to the place of harm, you're going to find the best solutions. And I think that's really something we need to advocate for and pay attention to.
You mentioned these social norms that have evolved over decades, centuries, whatever those are. Do you think it's important to look at the past as we chart a path to the future?
I think that's a really great question, and I do think it's important. And it's very challenging because certainly at the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, we are engaged in putting out fires every day, immediate, urgent matters in the communities we work with, whether it's a climate disaster or a fossil fuel pipeline that's going to go through a community and destroy it, or Indigenous rights that are being violated, or we're seeing some kind of deforestation project that would be a disaster. So there's this ongoing work of protecting biodiversity, protecting the climate, protecting forests, protecting Indigenous communities, protecting communities of color that often are where these terrible projects are happening because of racism and colonization. So there's all this urgent work that we must address because it's very immediate. But at the same time, I think it's so important that we actually have a historical analysis, because it's sort of like if you go to the doctor and you're not feeling well, they don't just start giving you things to make you feel better and remedies. They have to do an analysis and a diagnosis, which is on your health history, and find out what your symptoms are, and really do a deeper dive into what's causing the harm. And for me, when we talk about looking to the past or understanding a historical analysis, this is what I think is crucial. We need to understand, how did we arrive at a point where we are harming the earth at such an atrocious rate? We are harming frontline communities, and there's no end in sight. And so if we're going to really live in respect to the natural systems of the earth and live within the planetary boundaries, live with each other in a healthy way, then we need to understand the root causes of the harms and get a really clear diagnosis. And that means having a historical analysis on the roots of patriarchy, on the roots of colonization, on the roots of extractive economies, on the roots of patriarchy, and how did these interlocking systems of oppression get us to this moment? So we have this fast, hard work to do, and this also slow work to do of re-educating ourselves and unwinding these systems of oppression and being able to name them, because once you name them, you can begin to heal them and understand where they come from. And so I think we're in a situation where we have to do multiple things at the same time, or we're going to forever sort of be in the model of the whack-a-mole situation, where you put out one fire, but another one arises because you never dealt with the root cause. And so that's why I think the historical knowledge of how we got here is really essential.
Can you talk a little bit about rights of nature? I know you mentioned that in your writings, rights of nature, and how that's a framework part of the path forward.
It's work that I am very excited about and inspired with. Rights of nature basically is a form of earth jurisprudence or philosophy of law that really turns our current environmental laws upside down and inside out. Because right now, when we look at our current environmental laws, most of them are, one, viewing nature as property, where humans own nature. And we also have a lot of environmental regulatory laws, meaning governments are regulating nature and regulating activities in nature. And so we're regulating how much harm an industry or a project will do to the river or the forest or to the climate. And so we're not really stopping harms, we're regulating them. And as we know, with the powers that be and the way that industry runs now in our extractive economy and through capitalism, and everyone wanting to have, quarterly gains, that, regulation is a very dangerous path forward, because it keeps getting pushed to the brink of collapse in our ecosystems, because people want to keep extracting more and more, making more and more money and more profit. So what rights of nature does is it is an entirely different system that says, no, we need to look at the earth herself, the forest, the water, and they need to have rights, just like humans have rights. And we should not be passing laws or having any activities in the forest ecosystem, in a water system, in our ecological systems that harms nature in a way that nature cannot thrive and be healthy and survive and be within its own integrity, its own ecological integrity. And so I'm very excited about this, because it really puts humans back into the relationship we should be having with nature, which is, an equal partner in community with nature in the web of life, not above nature, but in a holistic equation with nature. And I think this is really vital, and we've really lost sight of that in modern society. And this idea of supremacy over nature is very, very dangerous. We need to sit in a circle with nature and see that we're part and particle of nature. And so it's not just an idea, it's actually really come into its own in the last years. In 2008, Ecuador became the first country in the world to put rights of nature in their constitution. And now several cases have been won in Ecuador where rivers have been protected using rights of nature legislation, that activities would harm the river cannot go forward. There are also in the United States over 36 now, I believe, cases that have been won on rights of nature in local communities to stop fracking and other harmful projects, again, advocating that nature has a right to be healthy. There are about 39 countries around the world now who are engaged in rights of nature work, advancing rights of nature in their countries. So it's pretty exciting, actually, to see this take off. and be effective. There was also just one last example. Earlier this year, there was a case in Spain of a river being protected under rights of nature laws, and the woman who led that case won the Goldman Environmental Prize for that. So, rights of nature might seem far-fetched when we were first working on it decades ago, but it's actually now something people are really interested in because it actually stops the harms and provides us with a different way of living in harmony with the natural world.
That's interesting. What other kinds of changes do we need to make in our society? I mean, we've talked about social norms that have evolved. The rights of nature is obviously a new thing that we're evolving to. Are there other major changes we need to make in our society to avert the worst impacts of climate crisis?
Well, for that, we'd need to read my book and spend about 20 hours. So I'll give
There you
a
go.
few top lines because it's just such a wonderful question. And, so much needs to be done. But I think rights of nature is a really good framework to stand on and for people to really explore. Like, we need these frameworks that are big enough to hold this moment where we're seeing what many are calling a polycrisis, which is economical and social and environmental. Like, we're in these intersecting crises. And so we need frameworks that can really hold and be expansive enough to address the level of the crisis. And I think rights of nature is a very good framework. Another one I would like to point out is I'm really honored to sit on the steering committee of something called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a parallel mechanism to the Paris Climate Agreement. And the Paris Climate Agreement, of course, is very important. All countries agreed to it. It has provided us the 1.5-degree guardrail in terms of global temperature rise and other things. But it also really focuses on carbon emission reductions, which is important. But if we really want to stop the climate crisis, we have to go to the source, which is fossil fuels, and get them front and center in the discourse and in the negotiations between governments, meaning gas, coal, and oil. Like, we have to deal with fossil fuels. And what the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty does is it is a mechanism for governments to come together and collectively get off of fossil fuels and move to a just transition and clean energy renewal, because things are not happening fast enough in the Paris Climate Agreement and the climate talks. We need a mechanism, explicitly a treaty on fossil fuels. And so I've been really excited about this work, and there are now 13 countries who've endorsed the fossil fuel treaty. And for me, one of the most exciting, all of them are exciting, but I'm recalling at a previous COP that I was at where Colombia, the country of Colombia, signed on to endorse the fossil fuel treaty. And it's really significant because they're a fossil fuel producing country. So it shows that even countries who are producing fossil fuels can engage in this process. And I think between rights of nature, the fossil fuel treaty, these are two really important frameworks that we can look at. And then lastly, I would just say that, we have to have a whole systems approach. Clearly, to me, we can't be thinking in just incremental changes at this point. We've been seeing floods and droughts and fires just exponentially going on around the world. Temperature continues to rise. There's a lot of, dangerous signals that we're getting from nature, to say the least. And so we have to really break through and have transformative policy, transformative conversations. And it's not only about what's happening at the government level and with financial institutions, it's also about us personally. We've got to get into the story. We are also actors in what is going on. And so I also think one of the most important things is to think about how do we engage? How do we engage our behavior? How do we engage overconsumption? How do we engage our relationship with nature? How we engage our understanding of colonization? All of these things are systemic changes that we have to look at, because it's not going to happen just because we put solar panels on a roof. We've got to do that, but we have to do a lot more.
There's several things in there to unpack. You mentioned just transition. What do you think would make a just transition to a clean energy future?
Yeah, I think that the just transition framework is really important, along with the treaty and rights of nature I mentioned, and it's being, discussed at every level of government and also in climate justice movements. And there's a lot of interpretations of just transition. And a lot of times we come up with these terminologies and they do get co-opted by business as usual and by corporations and transformed into something they weren't meant to be. So when we talk about just transition, originally it really stemmed from, very powerfully and importantly, the labor movements, that if we're going to stop fossil fuels, what is going to happen with all those workers, that they can't suddenly lose all of their jobs, and how do we then transition them into other jobs that have to do with renewable energy and clean energy, and how can we ensure that labor is included in this transition off of fossil fuels into a new energy economy. So it sort of started there, but it has now taken on a much broader, importantly, broader perspective and other thematics that are key to talk about. As an example, let's say, right now people are looking at how we're going to, move to into renewable energies and have a lot of electrification instead of fossil fuels. Well, when we go to this new economy, it requires enormous amounts of transition minerals. And where is all that mining going to go on? And so we could just duplicate the same problems we have with fossil fuels in terms of the extraction and harm to Indigenous and Black and Brown and frontline communities, and also harms to the global South in terms of the extraction that goes on for fossil fuels, and repeat that same problem by now extracting for transition minerals in those same communities. And so that's not justice. That's the justice part of the just transition. There has to be a different way that we go about providing our energy needs and getting the materials for them. So that's a part of the just transition, is how do we actually get to renewables without repeating harmful practices that are discriminatory and harmful. There's a bigger discussion about what kind of economy do we even want to have. In the just transition, do we want to continue this endless economic growth model that is destroying our planet and communities? And how do we actually have a new economic model based on what many are calling beyond growth or degrowth or circular economies? So the just transition is a huge conversation when we look at it and unpack it, which needs to be discussed, because it's truly looking at what kind of civilizations do we want to have, and how do we have ecological civilizations, and how do we care for all communities and lift all boats, and not just have the wealthy elite continue business as usual, because that's not truly a just transition. And that's why there's huge papers and research going on now and discourse around the just transition, because there needs to be a path forward that can work for everyone and for nature.
Your new book talks about worldviews. Can you tell us what a worldview is and why it's important?
So I was really excited to write this book because, having worked in this field for decades and doing a lot of things that we've been talking about and doing very practical projects, I really wanted to, again, look at root causes so that we could begin to shift things at a systemic level. And where I arrived at through, a lot of reading and research and contemplation, is that we needed to really address our worldviews. And it's an upstream approach of looking at, where did this idea of supremacy come from? Whether that's supremacy over the land or supremacy over Indigenous people, supremacy over Black and Brown communities, supremacy over nature, because it just seems to be a deep part of the root cause, this idea of being separate from the web of life and being superior. And once you think that, you can start causing harms to the other, so to speak. And so worldview is really addressing, where do our worldviews come from, and how do we reclaim worldviews that might be healthy and also dismantle and transform those that are not healthy. And so we have to look at our value system and what we care about. And one thing that I'm also looking at deeply in my book is our relationship to nature, and how in modern society, we've been often taught that we're above nature or separate from nature, instead of how many of our ancestors from all over the world understood that we were part of a living cosmology, that we were part of the river and the mountains and the forests and the birds and the animals, and that we are part of this interconnected web of life, and how that worldview completely transforms our politics and our economics once we begin to understand and really embody that we are part of nature, that we are part of this living system with a living cosmology. One, it's a lot more joyful. And two, it really changes how you consume things and how you view change because once you realize that you're part of nature, you don't want to harm nature. Once you understand that we're completely interdependent with the natural systems, it really adjusts and course corrects what we're doing. And so I think worldview is critical to this moment, because I don't think we take enough time to examine our own behavior and thinking, both individually and collectively, and that we can look to models, as an example, with Indigenous cultures and societies that have maintained an understanding of a living cosmology and being respectful of the natural laws of the earth. And how can we learn from those living systems that still respect a reciprocal relationship with nature that really puts us in balance with the natural laws? And I think this is what we really need to be looking at when we talk about worldviews, is a deep transformation, because clearly the worldview and values of our society right now are taking us off a cliff, to just put it quite frankly. And so it means a deeper shift than just moving external pieces on the chessboard. We actually have to do some deeper work here to think about who we are and how we're living.
Earlier, you mentioned biodiversity. You mentioned that 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is within indigenous lands. That's a huge number. That actually brings up two questions in my mind. I hear people discussing the preservation of nature, biodiversity, in context of decarbonization. Which is more important? Is there a balance between the two? Do we need them both? Where do we focus our resources? So I'd be curious to your ideas on that. And then also the question of, how do we intersect with the indigenous communities? How do we help them protect that biodiversity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have a way in our, speaking of worldviews and Western science, of compartmentalizing issues. And so for me, the decarbonization question and the biodiversity question are the same, because we're talking about forests, we're talking about landscapes, we're talking about water ecologies. It's all connected. We can't really do one without the other. Um, and I think Indigenous peoples have a very holistic view of how to care for nature and how to approach nature. And I think that it does behoove us to really take time to learn from Indigenous peoples, and that can start from wherever we live. Like, I live here in Northern California, and I've all my life tried to learn from, right now where I am in the Coast Miwok, but also from the Pomo, when I lived further north in my youth. And, mostly we live on stolen Indigenous land. So I think a good place to begin is just to acknowledge that and to metabolize that knowledge, and then, find out who the Indigenous people are where we live, and find out what kind of projects they're doing, or what kind of advocacy they have, or what kind of needs they have, and how can we lift up their leadership in their own territories and on their own lands. So I think that's a very practical thing that everyone can do, is just find out whose territories you're on, whose lands are you on, and how can you support local Indigenous peoples where you are. And then I think you can expand from there to really learning about something that Indigenous people really fought hard for on the global scale, on with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which people can learn about. And basically, Indigenous peoples, rightly so, went to the global community and demanded from the United Nations that they had unique rights. And they really shared that even though we have, all of us collectively, human rights, it's very individual. My human rights, your specific human rights. They put forward that they think collectively, and that they wanted Indigenous peoples, plural, to have collective rights, because that also ties them into their lands and territories. And so part of their rights have to do with where they live, which I think is something we can really learn from. So we're not separate from the places we live. And specifically, they have within those rights something called free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC. And it's something that in our organization and our advocacy we utilize all the time, because it is something that is part of Indigenous rights. And it basically states that, if a corporation or a government or whoever wants to go onto Indigenous lands and, have develop a fossil fuel project or do mining, that they must have free and prior and informed consent from the Indigenous people who live there, meaning that the Indigenous people are informed and are not just consulted, but given consent whether or not a project can come through. And why this is so key to protecting biodiversity is that many times Indigenous people will say, no, we don't want this deforestation project here. We don't want this logging operation, or we don't want this fossil fuel pipeline. And governments and corporations will push the project through anyway, and that right will be violated. And so when we talk about supporting Indigenous peoples, one of the most important things we can do is to listen to them and respect their rights, because they are protecting the biodiversity. And when they don't want a project, it's really important that we support them in asserting their right to say no, which is first and foremost respecting them and their territories and lands, and that should be enough, morally just correct to do that. But we also need to think and realize when they're doing that for all of us. And so I think this is something we can all, learn more about and support.
You're listening to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. We're speaking with Osprey Oriole Lake about the opportunities women's voices offer in world climate actions. I know you're a core participant in creating the world's climate action agenda. I was actually reading that this morning. That's a wonderful document. I'm wondering how that agenda looks after a decade.
Ah, my goodness. Yeah, the Women's Climate Action Agenda was one of the first things we did at WeCan, and it was developed through an event that we hosted in upstate New York in 2013. And it brought women leaders from all over the world together, Indigenous, grassroots, Black and Brown women leaders from over 50 countries. And women at the highest level of government and financial institutions. And we all came together, and, not that everybody agreed. It's really important to say we did not all agree, but we did hammer out over 4 days this Women's Climate Action Agenda. And I will be honest, I haven't looked at it recently. So I'll do my best to recall like maybe what are some of the different things. I mean, I think that the discourse around the role of women in the climate space has increased a lot since we wrote that document. So I think we've gained a lot of ground. When we go to the UN climate talks or to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, you will see that there's now gender responsive climate policies in the discourse amongst governments. That wasn't there before. So the fact of gender has shown up on the global stage as a factor. And I think that's something that we can all really be proud of, that we've really gotten somewhere. On the other hand, it's not nearly enough, and women are continue to be leading projects on the ground, leading movements, and are completely unrecognized, unacknowledged, and underfunded. So, we've gained some and not gotten nearly where we need to. Given the role of women and how much we're doing, there really is not the funding that should be resourced to all these amazing women's groups who are protecting our earth and their communities. But I think a lot of the things that we laid out are still very pertinent. I know we did a lot of work around women for forests, and a lot of work around women in climate policy that I still think holds true. And I think we've gained a lot of ground. But again, we can't think about incremental changes right now because things are happening so quickly. We need governments and financial institutions to understand that we need really bold transformative change. We don't have a lot of time. And so while I'm excited about what we've done, I also am so aware of the gaps.
I hear you there. You mentioned your Women for Forest program. Let's talk about that a little bit. I believe you focus on 3 regions: the Amazon forest in South America, the Tambwe rainforest in Africa, and what the Tongass rainforest and redwoods in North America. How's that program going, and how does that work?
Well, it's one of the programs I'm very excited about. It's really inspiring work. And I'll just give a few examples. We've been working in the Democratic Republic of Congo for about a decade, almost a decade now, with a wonderful coordinator. Our weekend coordinator is Nima Namadamu, and she's a Congolese woman. And over the course of, I guess it's about 9 years now, we have been reforesting an area called the Ntombe region in eastern DR Congo. And in case folks don't know, the Congo Basin, the Amazon rainforest, these are 2 of the main forests we need to protect for climate mitigation and biodiversity protection. And I would also add in Indonesian forests and boreal forests, but these are 2 that I'll talk about right now. And so we began tree planting with now over 1,000 women are engaged in the program, and 25% of the trees that we grow are for human use, which has allowed for the local communities to stop getting their needs from the forest and the old growth forest. So now, this many years later, pretty much the old growth forest is being protected, which is 1.6 million acres of rainforest in the Congo Basin, which is amazing. And the 25% that we've grown for human use is the primary reason for that. And then 75% of the trees we grow are to reforest the damaged lands through through the practices that have been going on there, through slash and burn techniques. And so that land had been decimated. And so, we've planted hundreds and hundreds of thousands of trees at this point. And I think one of the biggest breakthroughs is that it's all women-led. It's really helped them in their power structures in their communities. And also, scientists are telling us that the rate at which the recovery is going on in the forest is faster than they thought. So with all the trees we've planted, the biome is changing. Rains are coming back. There's a lot more moisture. And so in addition to the nurseries that we have, nature's providing her own what we call wild nurseries that we're protecting. And so we're seeing incredible regeneration of these forests. It's been really exciting. And then I'll just mention one of the projects that we're working on in the Amazon, where we're working with a group of women from Sariaco in southern Ecuador, where we have been, partners for years in forest protection work and continue to be. But they were also reporting to us that there are certain trees in this region that are going extinct due to extractive industries, whether it's mining or fossil fuels, and climate change. And so the project is for the women to go deep into the forest and collect seeds from these trees that are going extinct, and have nurseries where we grow these trees and replant them to regenerate ecological integrity of the Amazon rainforest in this area. And then just mentioning briefly, the Tongass rainforest in Alaska is the largest temperate rainforest, intact temperate rainforest in North America. And if you live in the United States, it is our climate forest, if you will. It's also been named the climate forest because it is where we sequester a lot of our carbon. And during the previous administration, there was a rollback of something called the roadless rule, which doesn't allow roads throughout this the Tongass rainforest, and it was to protect the old growth. Because once you have roads, logging happens and mining happens. And we were able to work with a group of Tlingit Indigenous women and a coalition of others. It wasn't just us, but we were central players in advocating to reinstate the roadless rule. And we were victorious in doing that. And we brought Tlingit women who had never been to Washington, D.C. on delegations, many delegations going to talk with lawmakers, to talk to the Forest Service. And it was very exciting to bring them and have them talk about the Tongass and why it needed to be protected. And now the roadless rule is in place, protecting over 9 million acres of old growth forest in the Tongass rainforest. And we will continue to have to fight for it. We don't know what will happen in the future, but we have had a really major victory there.
Sounds like a success there. In Africa, the Tambwe, it sounds like you're reaching some equilibrium there, which is really great to know. A little bit more on the Amazon and the Ecuador and Brazil. I know that that's very challenging from what we see in the news. What's your prospect for that area?
Well, the Amazon, scientists tell us the Amazon is at a critical tipping point, and it's quite scary. I still have a lot of hope that we can turn it around. But again, we have to look at the fact that fires are increasing because of global warming and how that is affecting forests all over the world, including at the Amazon. And, in the Amazon runs through 9 different countries. So, it's not just one story around the Amazon. But, as an example, in Brazil, there is a lot of hope because of the Lula administration and more Indigenous participation in government. But at the same time, there's a lot of industry there, like the fact of agribusiness there is very, very detrimental to the Amazon rainforest, where you're seeing, a lot of areas being opened up for cattle and soybean production. And all of that agribusiness leads to, unfortunately, not just natural fires happening, but people purposely lighting fires with impunity, unfortunately, and destroying large parts of the Amazon to open it up for these industries. So this kind of development is very dangerous, and we have to all, as a global community, think about what we can do to stop that. Um, and again, when I look at the Ecuadorian Amazon, there's still a huge amounts of mining going on for minerals and gold, as well as for fossil fuels. And so what needs to happen is Indigenous people are literally putting their lives on the line. Global Witness is constantly putting out reports every year on how many land defenders are killed, particularly Indigenous peoples, protecting their territories from industry and from business. And it's really tragic. So people are literally putting their lives on the line to stop harm. And yet, business as usual barrels ahead. And so this is why, we were talking earlier about an intersectional lens. It's so critical because the demands on, financial debt from the global south and how that relates to the global north, the demand for overconsumption, the demand for certain products keeps putting pressure on the Amazon rainforest. And so we can't really stop the harms to the Amazon rainforest and protect the Amazon if we don't look at root causes of what's causing the extraction and the harms to continue. And that's where we really look at like international convenings and global negotiations that have to go on, because it involves the stress and pressure that happens in those countries, not just within their own borders, but with the international community.
You're mentioning food, the cattle, the soybean systems to feed the cattle and that industry, which kind of brings me to your Woman for Food Sovereignty group that's addressing those kind of foods. It seems that most of our commercial food systems are based on fossil fuel usage and energy consumption. And, we see the side effects as in the cattle ranching that, it's deforesting the Amazon and such. I think food sovereignty is based more on the regenerative systems that are aligned with that traditional indigenous knowledge. Can you talk more about that sovereignty, what that is and how that helps address the climate crisis?
Yeah, I really love a lot of the work around food sovereignty and security because, again, I think what we're trying to do when we look at solutions is to get local, local, local. So the food sovereignty work that we do is really about local communities, Indigenous peoples being able to have land to grow their own food and to be able to control their own food shed, their own watershed, and also their energy, and having solar projects that are localized. And I think this gives enormous power to communities and also creates healthier communities. I mean, growing your own organic, healthy food is not only enjoyable, it also provides food justice. It also provides the fact that we're not shipping food all over the world, which can help mitigate the climate crisis because we're not shipping food halfway around the world, getting it packaged and then sending it back, and all of these things that we hear about all the time. But actually, being able to grow our own food, care for our own communities with the food that we're growing, and also it helps in terms of climate adaptation because, as we see more and more storms and heavy weather extremes, people get cut off from food supplies. And so if you're growing your own food, it puts you in a really different position. And so just as an example, we have a program in the Gulf South here in the United States that moves through Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. And we have a wonderful woman named um, uh, um, from the Huma Nation who is running the program and being able to trace out these old trade routes. And they're indigenous trade routes, and we're tracing them and along them having different plots of land that different indigenous leaders are then growing food, but also creating sort of islands of sustainability, for lack of a better term, where there's going to be mutual aid, where there's food for the community, or even some local traditional medicines being grown, or being able to have shelter there and have solar units. So kind of thinking ahead of like, how do you create these spaces where people can go in good times to enjoy themselves, but also in hard times. And so Monique Verdin, the woman I'm talking about, who's the Huma Nation leader, is our food sovereignty leader in the Gulf South. And it's just been very exciting to see over the last 4 years, all these different networks connecting to each other so they can localize and work locally or growing their food and caring for their communities. And then people can go there during times of crisis. And so this is sort of how I think of it, as like, these places where people can care for themselves as emergencies arise. But it also is a way of mitigating and adapting to the climate crisis as a whole, because even United Nations studies show that, the way out of the food crisis is to go local organic farming actually is a solution.
Yeah. Yeah. That's kind of local solutions. And you mentioned United Nations. So let's flip hats here. Let's go to that big picture. And I know you've been real engaged with the United Nations, attending the COPs, the conferences participants, and active with a lot of the United Nations climate programs. Let's talk about the CBD. That's the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. And we kind of touched on diversity a little earlier, but the CBD, how is that going? I mean, that's been going for what, 15 years now? Is it making progress? What still needs to be done there?
Yeah, it's on its 16th year now, coming on to its 16th year. And I would just say that I'll make a few comments, but I will say that my main expertise is in the United Nations climate talks, which have been going to over a decade. So I'll share what I do know about the CBD, but we have had less engagement with it. But we think it's very important because we're also very engaged in an understanding of a holistic view in which it's really hard to talk about biodiversity separate from the climate crisis. So one of the roles that we're playing is to help really unite this conversation, because it's absolutely critical. Because when we're talking about biodiversity, we're often talking about water. We're also talking about the oceans. We're also talking about forests. Well, all of those different ecological systems are key to the climate crisis as well. But specifically around the CBD, there's a lot of discussion around this global biodiversity framework that was established in Montreal. And how is it going to be implemented? How is it going to be paid for? And who is going to benefit? And all of those things have to be negotiated now that this framework was agreed upon. And I think the positive parts about it is that there is a recognition of Indigenous rights. There actually is an acknowledgement of women's leadership, which is really interesting. But how that will be interpreted is always, the tricky point is actually in the details. I think that there's also, the same dangers that we face in the climate talks, which is what they call biodiversity credits or biodiversity offsets. It's the same story that we see from the climate talks of carbon offsets and carbon markets. And so I think this does warrant a little bit of time just to say that it's a huge conversation. I'm just going to try to put it down to a few points, which is that we cannot look at resolving the environmental crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis in market mechanisms that got us into the crisis in the first place. And what is going on in the most simple terms is that business as usual, the wealthy elite, corporations and governments would like things just to stay as they are, but it's not working. And so they've devised these systems where, as an example with carbon markets, but it's true of the biodiversity credit markets as well, where it allows like a fossil fuel company to continue to extract in one region and pull material out of the ground and buy credits someplace else to offset that activity. And what happens is a few things. One, let's say they buy credits in a forest. That forest was already doing carbon sequestration before they bought it. So just right there, there's a little bit of mathematical problem in my mind with saying suddenly we're going to put a value on that when it was already doing that functionality. And then it doesn't stop the pollution. You're still polluting instead of stopping pollution at the source. And so that can't go on endlessly. And that's what is being attempted, is these carbon offset markets that are not actually stopping pollution at the source, but just offsetting them. But how much can we possibly offset? There's not even that much land base to offset it from, let alone enough forest to continue to do this. It's not a sustainable model. And yet that is the primary model that is being promoted by governments, is, whether it's biodiversity credits or by carbon offsets or carbon markets. It's all a market scheme that won't actually get to How do you protect that forest? How do you stop polluting? How do you stop extracting fossil fuels? How do we actually live in harmony with nature? And so we have, in our movements, we have a very big problem with these negotiations because they keep putting forward what we call false solutions instead of actually getting to what we need to do, which is consume less, live locally, stop business as usual, stop the extractive economy, respect Indigenous people's rights, and these things that we know to be true. And so funding needs to go to these community-led solutions and not to these big schemes that actually don't work. And even the last thing I'll say is one of the big companies, Vera, that was supposed to be monitoring the carbon credit schemes and the carbon offsets, even they last year came out and said, gosh, it looks like a lot of these credits are phantom credits. They don't even exist. Even the company that's monitoring them and promoting them had to admit it wasn't working. So I'll leave it at that.
You're obviously not a big fan of carbon credits. Are
No.
there other things you'd like to say about the UN's Framework Convention?
Um, I think that it's important that we continue to negotiate on the Paris Climate Agreement. It's not moving at speed and scale. And I think it's important that we keep having interventions with governments in that space to continue to talk about the things that we've talked about on this call today. That we need to have interventions about what's possible and bring in new ideas and talk about things like rights of nature and the fossil fuel treaty and community-led solutions and continue to push governments to do the right thing. So I think they're important spaces, but they also need to think very differently. And that's the role of civil society and organizations like ours to continue to go there and advocate and push the envelope. Because, the hope comes in is that when, things get really difficult and systems start collapsing and frameworks start getting shaken up, it's actually a time where new ideas have an opportunity because the system can't continue as it is. So that's a lot of where my optimism comes is there's so much good work going on and so many good people doing amazing things. We have solutions. I don't think we're lacking in solutions. We're having an interference with allowing people to do the business at hand they need to do. And that if we continue to push, and especially as we see cracks in the system, that's when we have these opportunities. And I think we just need to keep showing up and being there and doing this work.
So tell us about your new book, The Story is in Our Bones.
So in many ways, we've been discussing it. A lot of the ideas we've been discussing really relate to the book. I think it was very, very exciting for me to do a lot of the research in the book because I was very interested in these larger frameworks around worldview. And I really wanted to provide a roadmap. So it's a very deep dive that also has a lot of personal memoir in there, my own stories, a lot of personal storytelling. But it shares an arc of, how did we get into these interlocking crises? What are the root causes of them? And how can we provide a path forward that is holistic? But it's done through storytelling and it's done through a lot of technical details for sure. But it also shares a lot about what I like to call pre-patriarchal and pre-colonized histories, because I think it's also important when we're having this conversation about how do we regenerate our relationship with nature and heal ourselves and heal our communities, that we all can draw upon a lot of knowledge from our own histories and ancestries. Because a lot of times when we look to the past, it's very complex and we see a lot of harm from colonization and these systems of oppression. But I also wanted to give people a way who are not Indigenous or may not know a lot about their histories access to when their ancestors were living in harmony with nature, because I think we also need to heal a lot of our own trauma and our own misunderstanding of culture. And so the book is many layered, it's very wide ranging, but it's very specific on following this roadmap so we understand where we've been, where we are now, and what we need to envision. And what are all these connective tissue spaces in between? So if you sort of see like, this is where we are now in this polycrisis, and this is like the world we're envisioning. There's this space in between, and the book is really addressing this path and how we can get to the world we want.
Your group, the group you helped found, the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, created that to engage women worldwide in policy advocacy, on the ground projects, training, movement building for global climate justice. How can our listeners participate in your program? Where do they go to learn more about it?
Well, I welcome everyone to go to our website, which is www.wecan, WECAN, and then the full word international spelled out.org. So wecaninternational.org, and sign up for a newsletter. That's the best thing. I mean, you can read about all of our programs. We have lots of videos on our website. We have something called Women Speak, which is an online storytelling database to learn about what women are doing. But our newsletters is a really good way to really see what we're doing, on a monthly basis, and following us on Instagram and Facebook and on our social media channels. So those are different ways to plug in. And we often do webinars and things just, that we share with anyone who wants to participate. So there's always ways to engage.
Thank you. And thank you to our listeners. We welcome your questions and feedback. You can learn more about the Climate Hour at climatehour.net. That's climatehour.net. This is the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove.